Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Waterstones. Some of you, of course, know Darryl, so I don't think we need formal introductions, but for those that don't know, my name's Steve Levine. I'm a music producer, and some of the contents of this book, my paths have crossed some of his interviewees and recipients, and I guess most famously known for producing all of Culture Club's records, and of course Boy George being one of the greatest icons the world has ever known, features prominently in the book. But it's Darryl's book, so let me introduce Darryl for those that don't know. How many do know Darryl?
Oh, we're not going to have our hands up.
No, because we want to have it nice and informal, so there's no point in making it serious. So as you do know Darryl, then I won't introduce him further than welcome Darryl to Waterstones, and we're going to have a chat about the book and some facts. So do you want to just say a few words before we start?
Oh gosh, hello, thank you all for coming first of all, and thank you for braving the rain, because it was bloody horrible when we went out in it earlier on. I got absolutely soaked. Yes, as the lovely Steve has said, my name's Darryl Bullock. I've written a book which you might have seen advertised downstairs. It's this thing, and it's very briefly, it's a 100-year history of LGBT people making records. That's kind of it in a nutshell, and it's kind of how, we won't go into too much detail because I'm sure we'll talk about it in a second, but that's kind of what it's about, and several of you already know that, but for those of you who don't, have a listen.
Well, we'll start. So I am genuinely fascinated by this subject myself as a record producer, and as I was saying to Darryl when I spoke to him on the phone, first of all, I love the way the book is delivering it as an in-conversation, very much like this. And I think that makes it very readable. It's as if it's two people having a chat about great music facts, which I think is really fascinating. And you say it's 100 years of it's almost like the seeds of rock and roll started then. And the thing that I was absolutely fascinated at is that how many of the early pioneers were more in charge of their destiny then than people are now. And actually how some of those early pioneers, because it was a niche market, they were very, very well paid for the time. So let's set the scene up for those that may have not read the book or want to hear that really, really early history of rock and roll as music was just starting, and there was at that point hardly any chance of actually recording the music. So it was very much a live performance.
Well, it's absolutely true. We can go back, I mean, the book covers 100 years, starting in 1916, and it starts in 1916 because while I was researching, that was the kind of earliest record or the earliest song I could find that was written to be recorded by an out gay man for an out gay man, who happened to be his lover. The writer was an African-American pianist called Tony Jackson. His lover was a white American hustler, prostitute. But it was there was a period of time in the immediate post First World War, I guess, when the whole world, or certainly the developed world, as I suppose we think about it now, felt this kind of this new sense of freedom, this new sense of kind of celebration, this new sense of the war's over and things are going to get better. We can kind of do what we want, and there absolutely was a time when LGBT musicians felt as if they could kind of do what they wanted. They didn't have the constraints imposed on them, I guess, in later years by censorship, by the newspapers, by record companies who wouldn't dare spend money on people like that. So it was a really kind of very free and open time.
In fact, that's a really interesting point. The fact that it's just at the very, very dawning of the very earliest way of recording, because at this point we haven't even reached disc recording. And you're absolutely right. The record companies, very interesting how in that window of opportunity, there was freedom, and then recording started in the 20s, where discs were being cut, and then immediately the record companies, in the way that they censored, started to, because they were concerned even in the early days of not making any money from record sales.
Sure.
They started then going to black Americans to record what we now know of these incredible archives, once in a lifetime opportunities. But once again, many of your subjects were the artists that by default got recorded, and there are archives that exist of these incredible recordings.
Oh, absolutely. And you had
both male and
yeah,
female.
yeah.
And also, interestingly, how many female guitarists and artists were quite prevalent there.
Very much so. I mean, you wouldn't have early jazz and blues without female artists, and you wouldn't have blues, for example, without Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, Billie Holiday, people like that, Alberta Hunter, Lucille Bogan, who were all bisexual women. You know, record companies weren't interested in your sexuality; they just wanted a great voice. You know,
make some money.
They wanted to make obviously they wanted to make some money, but what they really wanted was a great voice with a great story to tell, and someone who was in command of their own career, who wrote their own music, because obviously, you know, it made it a lot easier for them to get them into the studio and knock something out really quickly. And they were very keen to jump on whatever they thought might be the next big thing. So when jazz kind of happened and exploded, and then blues kind of fed out of that, they were there every single time looking for what else might happen and what other genre might be next. But there was always the feeling then that nobody really cared about your sexuality. Nobody really cared about anything like that. It hadn't occurred to them at that point that it was important or remotely interesting. It's just, these are great songs. These are great performers. They're outrageous performers. They have a following, they have a large audience, partly because they're out and outrageous and you know, completely over the top. And let's exploit that. It was more about it's more about exploiting the audience, if you like, than it was about exploiting the artist or their sexuality.
Well, that's actually a very good point, because, as you said earlier, the record companies themselves were more keen on just making money. So by the fact that you use the word performance, most of these artists were performing live, and to a private audience in whatever club it was. But what was great was they were developing the early followings, and so the record companies could see, oh, they've got X number of people that like them, therefore X number of people will go and buy their disc. And in many cases, the technology has always fascinated me, that they developed technology so they could go to those clubs and record them.
Absolutely.
And record them in situ. And then you had, the thing that we're doing now, a kind of, 70, 80-year version of that, capturing that moment.
Absolutely, it's absolutely true. And as the audiences developed, and as time went on, if we're looking right back in the 20s and 30s,
Yes.
This is happening at a time when the States is going through prohibition, when the world we're just a little bit earlier than hitting the Depression, but we're going through. What did I just say before Depression? What was that word? Prohibition. Prohibition. Yes. So street front bars were closing down all over the States, and underground bars, speakeasies, were opening up. A lot of them run by the mafia, a lot of them run by mob gangs, all those kind of things. But these places were desperate for entertainers, and they were all vying with each other to bring in the next biggest, most outrageous, most in-your-face act they could find, because they knew that would drag a bigger audience in. So the prohibition actually kind of created an underground scene that allowed LGBT artists to flourish. And allowed a thing called the pansy craze to flourish in the States, where we had lots of LGBT performers and songwriters going out into bars and into bars and into clubs, and for the first time actually performing as themselves, rather than as a man in a dress, for example, but actually performing just as a camp man, which was kind of outrageous for the 20s. It hadn't really happened before. You'd had decades and decades on stage of men dressing as women, women dressing as men, Vesta Tilley in Britain, things like that. But it was only really at this point in the 20s that gay artists felt comfortable enough to express themselves as themselves, rather than assuming a mantle. Their whole act was just themselves. Their whole act was being themselves, their entire life. And then as prohibition continued, as all these kind of underground bars were fighting each other for the bigger act, the bigger audience, this develops not only in America, But throughout Europe, every major city in Europe had its own underground scene. It was similar. In London, we had Noel Coward and Douglas Bing. In Berlin, we had the Weimar Cabaret. It happened in Vienna, in Paris, in Madrid. Just about everywhere you can think of, there was this underground scene happening, and it was all very open. It wasn't necessarily liked by the authorities, but they put up with it. It was okay. It wasn't going to. Nobody was that fussed about it. And these stories are there. We know these stories because they were making headlines in newspapers, and people were writing about them in a very matter-of-fact kind of way. And then, of course, we have the Depression kick in, and then in 1933, we see the rise of fascism in Europe, and it all goes underground. So we've had a period of best part of 2 decades where LGBTQ artists, performers feel comfortable enough in their own skin to be out in public, to be performing in public, to be known for what they are, and to be written about in the press. And then suddenly everything gets thrown underground again. And this is the sort of thing that happens in a time of war, in a time of struggle, in a time of fiscal problems, like we're seeing currently. We're seeing this happen. We've seen this happen the last few years with the rise of the right wing again in Europe, and with our own kind of financial hassle in this country over the last few years. What happens is this kind of swing to conservatism, and this stuff all gets pushed back under the carpet again.
And this is true, that in those moments there is always another sort of seam happening. You mentioned briefly about songwriting, and I thought what was interesting is that how you see just before the Second World War starts, it almost everything gets put on pause during the war, because, as you say, there is fascism. The Nazis absolutely were awful at their, just before they were elected, particularly in Berlin, pulling apart the clubs and really destroying them, and they weren't even officially elected at that point. But the songwriting was starting to develop. So through this terrible, terrible time, people were writing lyrics that were from the heart, and that was the beginning.
Oh,
although
absolutely.
it was put on hold,
Yeah.
it then came to fruition after the war.
Yeah.
And I think that was something that is, through this terrible, terrible time, people are writing, as you say, they were free to openly be as they are, but then to write lyrics, because the first period, as you say, it goes back to the Victorian musicals, so they were the kind of words that everyone knew, whereas this period starts from people writing from the heart, don't they?
Yeah,
and
very much so.
It's setting the table out for what we're about to have in the 50s.
Yeah, you do. I mean, people, it's always the writers first, isn't it? The people like Noel Coward especially were kind of expressing themselves in their own way. Coward's writing songs about like Mad About the Boy, for example, at this time. And even when Mad About the Boy was going to debut in New York, he rewrote the lyrics. They were very much, very obviously about a man. It was about a man talking about a man. They refused to perform them, sadly. But he was very, very aware of what his role was and what he should be doing. And you had people on stage like Douglas Bing, who I mentioned earlier on, who was singing incredibly, what we think of now as kind of camp cabaret songs, but at a time when we're kind of heading into war. People were, the pockets where it was happening were much more restricted, much more confined than it had been, pre-war, or pre-Second World War rather. But even during the war and right through into the 50s, there were still little pockets, little enclaves happening where artists felt they could express themselves.
And as we move forward, let's sort of move forward to the 50s period now. We're looking at the sort of, the Dirk Bogarde era, the era of art. We mentioned lyrics, but now we're starting to see film directors, because we're now in the move, the world of exploration there, in terms of some people being very open in their depth, the way that they're framing the shots, others being more discreet with it.
Yeah, but I mean, the problem you've got then, of course, is post the Second World War is we're still living through a very conservative state throughout the Western world. The police are clamping down on everybody. The law is very much against anybody deemed to be different, anybody that doesn't live up to that nice kind of straight, white, sorted norm. So again, although there are obviously performers and writers and recording artists out there, they're very much underground. There's at no point during this period does any man or woman stand up and say, I am a gay man, I'm a bisexual or a lesbian woman, and this is what I do. It just doesn't happen. And it really doesn't happen until you get the 50s and the birth of rock and roll.
Well, that's what I was trying to winkle out of you, because the way you talk about people like Little Richard, you've got almost the same thing, another sort of generation starting again. So you've got the kind of black American artists who are now developing rock and roll in the same way that a generation before they were ragtime. Or,
you have, absolutely. And you've got Little Richard, you've got Escarita, you've got a fantastic doo-wop act working in New York called Charlie and Ray, which is just brilliant, who sadly I only found out about after I wrote the book, and I wish I'd have known about them earlier because I'd love to have included them in there. They wrote or performed 9 amazing kind of proto rock and roll records. There were acts out there doing it, but even Richard, Richard's gay, he's straight, he's bi, he's straight, he's got God, he's left God, he's all over the place, isn't he? Little Richard's kind of proto Boy George, he's all over the place, he's all over the shop, he can't make up his mind from one minute to the next what he wants to be, and that's fine, that's his prerogative, I guess, if he wants to do that. But it really, although there are artists who are, pushing that envelope a little bit, the big money's there. The record companies are taking a hold. They can't. There's no one that has the wherewithal, the ability to come out in public and say, I'm a gay man or I'm a lesbian woman, without losing their career. It's because there's no way that their handlers, who, let's face it, at that time and still today are pretty much all middle-class white men, are gonna let that happen.
But then as we enter this rock and roll world, we also enter the beginnings of the impresario world, where you've got people who are controlling the kind of puppet masters who happen to be gay, again, for business reasons, have to keep their identity very, very private, and yet are able to have this little world where they know what the next big thing is going to be.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? And it kind of, you probably tell I don't know a lot about fashion, but it kind of makes me think of the way the fashion world works. As it's very clearly run by gay men, but nobody ever really talks about the fact that it's run by gay men, and but we kind of constantly dragging things forward. And it was very much the same with music, especially in the late 50s and early 60s. The pop music in Britain was run by gay men. Completely run by gay men. Larry Parnes, Brian Epstein, Andrew Loog Oldham, Kenneth Pitt. Go on. Simon Napier Bell, Jonathan King. The list is endless. But they knew what the public wanted. They knew that screaming girls wanted pretty boys, kind of thing. In exactly the same way that Louis Walsh.
But also, this is a time when you've also got some record executives as well. So you've got this kind of inner sanctum, and then there's also within.
Yes, of course there is.
So I think that's an interesting.
Joseph Lockwood around EMI was.
I was just going to say that's the beginning of the kind of start of a business club as well, where things get done because of, not in spite of.
It's the gay Masons, it's the Pink Mafia, whatever you want to call it. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. And there's no way they're going to let any of their artists come out because they're worried about what those screaming little teenage girls are going to do. They want the little girls sitting in the Odeon, wetting their knickers on the stage while the Beatles scream on. That's what they want because it makes money and it makes an absolute fortune for them. They can't allow any of these artists to ruin their career, to endanger their sales in any way by admitting their sexuality. And so you've got people in the kind of mid to late 60s, Elton, Long John Baldry, people like that, who were clearly gay, who were gay amongst their friends. Everybody knew there was no lying that, no denying that, but they couldn't dare go out publicly.
But also, we're in a period pre-social media where we are today, and kind of what went on in the studio stayed in the studio, which is an interesting world. I think if times were different, if we had today's sort of instant social media of everyone knowing everything, maybe some of that would be different.
Well, I think it would be different, but we needed things like the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality here in '67. We needed Stonewall in '69. We needed the, We needed the Gay Liberation Front in 1969, 1970, and things like that to give people the confidence to start to come out, to start to be more open about it. And then you do see almost immediately things start to happen. You know, Bowie turns around to the press in 71, 72 and says he's gay. Dusty Springfield did it 18 months before him in 1970, you know. You see people like Jabriath in the States and Stephen Grossman and people like that signing to major labels as out gay artists. So it happens really, really quickly. Kind of cosseted by glam rock, kind of given a sheen, a patina of respectability, or even not even that so much, but almost like a camouflage, because you know glam rock allowed you to be so completely and utterly outrageous. I mean, think of acts like Mud, or you know, stuff like wearing, you know, not Les Gray, but I can't remember the name of the bass guitarist who then went on to write songs for just about everybody, wearing culottes on top of the pops and dangly ear and looking like Pat Butcher for all, you know, for all the world to see. It gave, like the stage always has done, the stage has done for centuries, it provides camouflage. So it allowed people to be a little bit more outrageous, a little bit more crazy, a little bit more camp, but it also allowed acts who wanted to come out the chance to do that. And so you see Dusty and Bowie and Lou Reed, Mark Bolan, even Freddie kind of started to try and do it in the 70s, and then they went straight back in the closet again and didn't come out again, sadly. But they're all up to it suddenly because they
still
feel
have someone
there's
like
freedom.
Simon Napier Bell with Mark Bolan, so there's still a hint of the previous generation. But what's so lovely here is you're setting the stall out now. You mentioned the glam rock. You're setting the stall out for the third generation. If we think of the kind of the 60s lot being the second generation, but from the very originals, we're now in the third generation. As you say, you know, one of your previous examples was Tom Robinson. You're starting to see artists that are, as you say, putting their stall out straight away and going, this is what it is. And you told me about someone in Nottingham saying about Tom's quote. I mean, we both know Tom quite well, so it's...
Yeah, I mean, Tom Robinson was really important for me because I consider Glad to Be Gay to be my coming out song. I was, I don't know, 16, 17 when I first heard that song, and when I saw him do it on The Secret Policeman's Other Ball, do it live, although it'd been out a couple of years before that. I wasn't really aware of it. And before that, I always thought gay music meant disco, and I didn't like disco. Yeah. So kind of I was this... When I was 13, 14 years old, I attempted to come out to my father, and it didn't go very well. And so I went straight back in the closet, and I stayed there and shut that door and, you know, threw the key away and wasn't going to come back out. And then I saw Tom Robinson perform Glad to Be Gay. And it was a complete eye-opener to me because for the first time that I was aware, as a 16-year-old dealing with my own sexuality and going through puberty and dealing with, you know, finishing school and going into the workplace, all that kind of crap, I suddenly came across someone who wrote this, like, you're allowed to be angry. He made this amazing record that resonated with me, that I could actually, I understood, that I kind of got what was going on in there and kind of gave me permission to be angry. It's all that thing I said earlier on about how, you know, artists and situations give people permission to do stuff. You know, Bowie gave a generation the permission to be different. Tom Robinson gave me permission to be out.
And I think what was good with Tom is that I remember that situation quite closely, because when Tom first started, Dingwalls was the kind of London haunt where most of those... And my brother actually did take some of the very earliest shots of the Tom Robinson band. So I was there from day one. But what I thought was interesting about that, as you say, is that was the first time I went to a gig myself and saw a mixed audience. Those that were young boys that were absolutely gay and that were using Tom as an icon, and then those that just wanted to hear great, what was then kind of the pub rock. We hadn't quite got the full punk. I think Tom never quite managed to be the Clash or punk, but it was kind of a glorified pub rock, of which there were many.
Not very much so, yeah.
But what was exciting was that those are really, really well-attended gigs. And I thought, so it's interesting you mentioned that, because to me, as a lover of that era of music, you know, that was my kind of... Yeah. Everyone has their block of when their cycle comes around. So for me, that punk movement was very much the start of my career. But to see the reaction the music had, and as we mentioned earlier about the songwriting, these were lyrics that Tom was writing both from the heart and also, as you say, as a form of protest as well.
Well, it was a protest because Glad to Be Gay came out of what I kind of consider to be Britain's Stonewall, and that was this series of raids on London bars in the mid-70s. But I think what people forget is that punk wouldn't have happened without the LGBT community. You know, we were because it is, you know, it's, well, I consider it a we, and I hope you all, or many of you would consider yourself part of that we. Punk would not have happened in the way it happened if it wasn't for the gay community, because, you know, they had nowhere to go, they had nowhere to play, they had nowhere to drink, they had no kind of support whatsoever. These young disaffected kids in, you know, scuffing around London, and it was the gay clubs that gave them place, gave them place to practice, gave them place to rehearse.
And quite a lot of the fashion icons that became part of
Oh,
it.
absolutely.
You know,
yeah, the whole thing went straight through the Blitz scene and onwards. Yeah.
And well, as we move to the Blitz, then I think that's something that's fascinating. I love the fact that in the book you say, you know, for me, as a 59-year-old, of course, the David Bowie Top of the Pops moment was great. But then, as a record producer, the Boy George moment on Top of the Pops was my equivalent of that. And it's great that you draw a parallel in there. So I'll throw that over to you because you, obviously...
Well, it is a parallel.
Yeah.
And I think, for me, that's what I would hope people take away from the whole book, is that not only is it cyclical, not only does it go round and round and round in circles, but this follows an entire timeline. And my argument, if there is an argument for this, is that, you know, LGBTQ people, musicians especially, have basically invented every single genre of popular music from day one.
Yeah.
You know, from the beginning of jazz right through to the techno dance scene that we have today. Everything. We've been there at the beginning of it. We were there at the beginning of jazz, at the beginning of blues, and all the way through. Rock and roll, as we briefly discussed, you know, and of course, you know, Boy George is as important to the artists that came after him and the generation that grew up watching him as Bowie was to Boy George and to you know, Holly Johnson and to Mark Almond and to, you know, those people.
And I had many conversations with George in the studio because we keep going back to this thing of writing from the heart and writing song lyrics. You know, we knew from day one that George and John were in a relationship. But Tony, the manager, said, oh, you know, we can't really discuss... Even though it was fairly obvious that George was very open, John himself wanted to keep it more private.
Yeah.
And it was only towards the end of the band's career that he felt confident enough, and it was really confidence to be open about his sexuality. But all the lyrics that George was writing, the great thing about it, they were being written from a gay boy perspective about his relationship primarily with John, and yet, of course, the words resonate with the entire world. And I think that was, for me, fascinating to see his growth as an artist. And you mentioned it in the book, but he's also, from first hand, I remember witnessing, before we had email, the roadie used to come by the studio with a big sack of mail. And I mean like these big, giant Postman Pat sacks. And George would be reading them. They eventually did have a fan club administrator. But what was fascinating about them is so many young boys had written to George direct and said, I am so pleased that you're doing this, I love your lyrics, but I feel that I now have the confidence to be open with my own parents. And that, to me, was absolutely fascinating. And each time there's another cycle, you say it, but there's the cycles of generations. I think the confidence grows and it gets bigger and bigger each time. So on the next wave, I mean, I don't know who, you know, maybe it's Sam Smith today, I don't know, but each generation has another person that opens the doors, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's something
absolutely.
that follows through, like a kind of rock family tree timeline.
Yeah,
isn't it?
absolutely, and that's exactly what it's all about. Is that every generation influences the next generation, and you know, for every, you know, for Bowie it was Little Richard, for Boy George it was Bowie, for John Grant it was Boy George, and so on and so on. There will always be someone, but yes, every single time, as we, you know, as we are lucky enough to enjoy more and more freedom and more and the openness to express ourselves in you know, in better and less couched ways, there will always be somebody there that's kind of helping, you know, just as it happens in fashion, kind of drag that audience along with them.
Fashion has cared less, but music has cared more, and yet now, of course, with everyone being able to make any recordings they want and distribute them how they want, the record companies don't have that control anymore. So therefore, I think absolutely from the moment the the song is written or the work is conceived, those artists can be completely free.
That's true, and that's really important in countries where LGBT people don't enjoy rights. Yeah. It's especially important in places, in countries in Africa, for example, or in Jamaica, or places like that, Russia, where China, where LGBT rights are just being stamped on constantly. Musicians out there can still reach their audience. They don't have to get a record out. They don't have to go inside to a company. They don't have to sell out in that way. They can do something the Pro Tools at home on their little home recording studio and whack it up on YouTube, and it's there for everybody. Look at Art Attack in Nigeria. It's and how important that record was for so many local people who have no voice. There's a fantastic Arabic group, and I never ever pronounce this right, but I believe the group is pronounced Mashu Lila. It's led by a American Lebanese guy called Hamed Sino. Mm-hmm. All 4 or 5 guys in the band speak perfectly good English. They could, if they wish to, record in English. They don't. They record in their own language, in their own local patois, so that their own audience living in the Lebanon can understand what they're singing about. And all their songs are about LGBT rights, LGBT lives, our community. People living in war-torn places around the world are doing this. People living in places like Jamaica who are stoned, just for being gay, are doing this. They're out there pushing the barriers still, in just the way, in exactly the same ways that the generation before us were barricading the doors to Stonewall or marching in that first gay pride march in London in 1971. They're still they're still doing it, and those kind of people still need our support. But it's easier in some ways for them to get their message out these days.
Yes, I think that is a very, very good point, that it is so much easier, and it's also much harder for people to start censoring things, which I think...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that happened with the Art Attack track. There were threats from the local government or the national government about, trying to get YouTube and Google to take it off, and they wouldn't. It was still available, and strangely, as soon as the government start complaining about something, suddenly there are millions of people watching the damn thing all over the world, which is great, and you're reaching a far bigger audience, because the minute somebody tries to censor something these days, no, everyone's watching it. We all know what's going on.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic that musicians with a message no longer need to be in the thrall of a record company. It's sad in a way, because there are people who have worked in records for years who are struggling to make a living out of it these days. But it does mean that as we consume our music in so many different ways these days. We don't just buy records anymore. We listen to SoundCloud, Spotify, MP3s, YouTube, whatever else it might be. The world's open to everybody.
But also, you mentioned so many times about everything being cyclical, but of course those artists now that have a good following, such as John Grant, such as Mark Arman, the live arena from them is more powerful than it has ever been, sure. And is continually growing. So I think that's, in Culture Club are still out on tour, touring bigger venues than they did in the 80s.
Mark Arman's just been out on tour,
And they're lucky because, Mark and their voices are still pretty damn good. Mark is quite impressive, actually. So if they have a voice in both senses of the world, then that allows a new audience. And it's almost gone back full circle that it might even end up being quite a niche market that they're playing to. But if you've got your loyal followers, they'll pay their ticket and they'll come in.
Absolutely, yeah.
So how do you feel then, as you lay your stool down for this? Obviously, we've put... Like all these things, isn't there? There's a ton of research that you do, which is so fantastic. And as you mentioned earlier, the moment you sort of press save, there's another whole load load more that comes through, isn't there?
Well, there is, and it hopefully it won't end. This book's finished now, but hopefully the story will go on, and people will keep. Well, obviously, people are going to continue to make music, and new artists will emerge, and new artists will find a following. So, hopefully, things will continue. This only scratches the surface. It really does. It's only 320 pages. It only scratches the surface. There's so much more. And what I would love if people buy the book and they like the book, they actually go out and discover this stuff for themselves. I hadn't really heard much about John Grant until I started writing the book. I owned one album, and that was it, and it was okay. I quite liked it, but as I started writing the book, and I was trying to get an interview with him, and something became a bit more important to me. And I got over the other records, and I went to see him live, and it absolutely blew me away. It was the most cathartic and almost sensorial experience I'd had at a gig for years. Just stunning.
Well, I completely agree. We saw him here in a regular concert at the Liverpool Phil, which was fantastic. But also, I had the lucky privilege that when we did Culture Club's Colour by Numbers with Radio 2, John was one of the singers.
Yeah, sure.
And in the rehearsal, when he did Black Money, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Black Money, but we had a kind of short list of who we wanted to sing and which songs. And just George and I thought Black Money would be just so great. And John said, I'd love to. Well, I have, standing an inch away from somebody when they're rehearsing and then stopping and then the orchestra, and literally the unbelievable sense of just, whoa.
I walked out of that gig on air. I mean, floating down the road. It was just incredible.
Just really such a feeling that you think, wow, that's...
And I think one of the great things about artists like that, and I think other artists like Sia is another one, and people like that, because they cross genres. They're not just stuck in one pocket. They can take an audience with them, and they can bring a new audience in, and music actually then is doing what it should be doing, which is bringing people together, not kind of isolating people, but actually bringing people together.
The other one that was breathtaking on the session, who I was really blown away with, was Jimmy Somerville. I have never... Sure. Well, first of all, his voice is exactly the same as when he was 17, which is incredible. But I was actually talking about him yesterday to someone else for a session. He's incredibly professional, and I have to be honest, I wasn't a massive fan originally of his stuff, but when I saw him perform with George, I saw him in a different light, and I'm talking only purely on vocal dexterity, and he was just breathtaking, really, and I'm so pleased that we used him on those sessions. So here's another one. But John Grant, as you say, is an artist who I think is really only scratching the surface of what he's capable of doing, and he tells these phenomenal stories of, you hint at them, just the sort of area that he came from in America, the whole religion, the oppression on his shoulders of being a gay man.
He's incredibly honest. He's really, really honest and really open.
It's just like, my God, it's just incredible. And talking to him, you realise that that's why he's chosen to live in Iceland and be, to live a freer life.
But you touched you mentioned Jimmy Somerville then, and Jimmy is massively underrated.
Yeah, I agree.
He's one of the most important gay artists of all time, and really, really needs. And I don't think he gets it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why he shies away from a lot of stuff. He doesn't do any interviews. He doesn't talk very often about stuff. He is incredibly important, and what was happening in the 80s with Bronski Beat and Small Town Boy opened the door for so many people. Not only for acts to come in after that, like Frankie and.
Well, I think Holly mentions that specifically, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
That's a really important.
It's incredibly important, and what he did, and what he continues to do is massively, massively underrated.
I mean, the other great thing with Holly, of course, is that because they'd signed to Trevor Horn, is that Trevor was very happy for them to be what they were, and didn't have to. He was like the kind of bridge between them and the record company, so he was able to go, well, this is what I've seen live. I remember him having great stories about how he came up here and saw them live, and he was just absolutely blown away with it, and wanted to capture a high fidelity version of that, and didn't want to change anything. And he saw them at one of the clubs here, and said that's the thing that is the great. It's not just the great music; it's Holly's vibe and the audience that they appeal to. They have a synchronicity with them.
Yeah,
he didn't want to lose that, because he thought that would definitely that magic that he had would work for both a straight audience and a gay audience, and he was absolutely right with that. And I know Holly said in many interviews, as you mentioned about Jimmy being very, very important to him even though they're not vocally the same.
No, not at all.
Interesting, yes. So where do we go from here?
I'm going for a Chinese.
No, I don't.
I'm going to have a Chinese and a glass of wine.
What's your next one?
The next book wouldn't interest anybody here, and the people who do know about it would be bored to tears if I go on about it again. It's about my previous book to this was a biography of Florence Foster Jenkins, and the next book, shut up, Dean. my next book will be on a kind of similar subject. So it's about an absolutely terrible vaudeville act from America at the end of the 19th, early 20th
some
century.
Of that film here.
Yes, I know. Yeah. I've done the tour.
Have you seen the film?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
I haven't got around to seeing it, but I remember when they were filming it. I was trying to,
But it's another biography, but it's not. It won't be anything like this one. It's going to be a kind of a slightly more tongue in cheek, hopefully a bit more of a fun read, and a lot less political. This is quite political, this book, and hopefully a lot less political.
Well, we have a few minutes to do some questions. So I see we have our young man with the microphone.
Oh, never mind. You can have one of these.
You can shout and we'll read. So anyone, yes, gentleman with the red striped shirt. I'll redo the question. So shout it out.
Darryl, I've got that book you've been talking about. I've also got the Forest Project.
Oh, fantastic! Thank you very much. That you bought it.
Fine. Yeah, it's a bit off subject, but I kind of think there are some out LGBT classical artists.
Yeah.
But the glass closet is probably in there more, not totally, but more than it is with popular jazz artists.
Yeah.
Do you see any sign? I mean, obviously, ironically, the people who supported her were, to a large part, not only gay men a long time ago. Do you see that beginning to lift? Classical performance?
I'm really, really glad you asked that question, because only a couple of months ago I took part in a panel discussion at a festival in Birmingham, which was based around new classical music written by queer composers, and I was amazed at the the misogyny and the outright hatred shown towards not so much gay men, because it kind of goes hand in hand with classical music, but towards bisexual men and women, towards lesbians, especially towards queer and trans people in classical music. And funnily enough, I approached The Guardian with an idea about an article about this exact subject, because I think it's horrific. I mean, obviously this book specifically is about pop music or popular music. I didn't touch classical at all. But it's crazy. I cannot understand why there's so much kind of such a narrow view of within classical music of anybody that is either non-binary. It's beyond me, and that's something that absolutely needs discussion and needs looking at. Yeah.
No, that is a very interesting, because when I first started at 17, I used to do a lot of classical sessions as an engineer, and on a classical session you have 3 producers, and in my experience, every single one of all of those producers was gay from all the major labels.
But you won't
without
see
exception, and incredibly kind of camp as well, and yet. As you said,
but anybody queer identified or trans identified or lesbian, no, forget it. They are shut out.
Yeah.
They are completely silenced by the classical music world, and it happens also in.
Well, that's back to your conservatism.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just because of the bulk of the audience for that is white middle class.
I think a lot of it probably is, but it also happens within the funding for classical music, and in conservatoires and places like that. They just refuse to fund anybody that doesn't fit their nice little world, and there are a lot of very angry trans-identified and queer-identified composers who are, banging on that door trying to get in and not being able to get in there at the minute.
And you mentioned earlier about some of the Middle Eastern music, and there's a lot of great, we said pop, but actually, I define a lot of that great music is actually classical, of their own version, and so this is another issue that needs to come forward. That was an excellent question because it sparked the debate. Anyone else with anything equally fiery or? No? One great question's better than...
It always happens.
Yeah.
It always happens.
Everyone gets very nervous about this.
I don't know why. Quite approachable, really. There you go.
Yes, sir.
Should we take a look and get an announcement from Michael Ball and Al?
Do we need one? Does the world need a gayer Michael Ball? Bless them. No, I think they're quite happy doing their own thing. I don't think we necessarily need an announcement for them. I don't think they're getting married yet, are they?
But certainly don't need any more music from them. That's
well, bless. No, there's a market for that kind of stuff, just like there's a market with Susan Boyle. Yeah. There's a market for this. And Jane McDonald, there's a market for it somewhere. I should say Jane McDonald around here. That's allowed, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Ethel Merman.
Yes, sir.
Is there anyone else?
Oh, that's a good one.
Wow. Jackie Shane. Yeah, Jackie Shane. Amazing singer, originally from Nashville. Went to Toronto. Made some great records with a band called Frank Motley and his crew. Trans woman, although usually performed as a very heavily made up man, if that makes sense. So kind of probably didn't know she was a trans woman at the time. We kind of dealt with herself as a gay man, I guess. Made some phenomenal records, which are hen's teeth rare these days, just impossible to find. But a company called Numero have just reissued pretty much everything. There's 2 or 3 songs missing, but pretty much everything she recorded on a double album just come out. It's phenomenal. It's like Aretha Franklin meets Otis Redding, meets Little Richard, meets James Brown. It's just stunning stuff. Sticks and Stones. What a great record. Seriously, Jackie Shane. Look her out. She phenomenal. You will never ever forgive yourself if you don't hear her.
Some of the artists you mentioned early on in the book, actually, just I think before we spoke, I got an email from there's an American archive has put together a huge amount of those early recordings. So if anyone saw the American the Jack White thing on BBC 4, it's like the kind of appendage to that was the documentary part as opposed to the performance part, looked at some of these artists. But and I've completely forgotten the name of the company, but there's a company who's the Library of Congress has a large amount of this, and so someone's had access and digitized it, and it's available. So some of those artists that you mentioned, you can actually now, for the very first time, this is literally a month ago, it's been available. It's all free, which is incredible that these recordings actually do exist. So, I mean, I personally love that stuff.
Sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And you can just see the roots of so many things in it. There'd be no Led Zeppelin, there'd be no Eric Clapton. They're all, you hear the riffs and you go, my God, that was in 1920, and it's. Yeah.
Well, I talked right at the beginning about Tony Jackson back in 1916. We don't know, he unfortunately didn't leave any recordings. His songs were recorded by other people. But Jelly Roll Morton, Tony was a mentor to Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton recorded a series of interviews for the Library of Congress, and he recorded a short piece of this particular song. This song's called Pretty Baby, which featured the original lyrics. Otherwise, we would never know them. They'd been lost. They've been lost forever. So the Library of Congress is an incredibly important archive. Yeah,
for all those things. But I think when you do have access to that music and you can hear it because they've also cleaned them up as well. Yeah. So I mean, it's just incredible to hear how revolutionary those artists were and how we, as you say, we all owe a huge debt.
Stunning.
Right from the beginning.
Stunning. But the great thing about that kind of music and those artists from the 20s and the early 30s is the amount of enjoyment in those records. They are so much fun. They are really life-affirming. You listen to Ma Rainey singing Prove It On Me Blues, where she's singing about her life as a lesbian. It's just amazing. Or you listen to Lucille Bogan's songs. I mean, they're just so life-affirmingly wonderful. They're rude, they're crude, but they're bloody great.
Well, because they take the musical heritage, but as you say, they're starting to write lyrics that a standalone is like a little story, isn't it? Like a little soap story.
Yeah.
Go, yes. So any more questions? If not, we'll... yes, sir.
I'm just wondering if we're going to see a soundtrack to the book.
That's a very good idea.
It'd be a really hard thing to license, but if you go onto Spotify...
You could do a Spotify playlist.
Look on Spotify and look for David Bowie Made Me Gay. You'll find a 2-hour playlist on there. I did a piece for The Quietus a month or so ago, and there's a kind of a YouTube video per chapter, so you can do it that way if you want to. But Spotify's the best one. There's like a 2-hour playlist of and a lot of the kind of more obscure stuff is in there as well.
Yes, because the licensing would be a nightmare.
Yeah. I can't imagine. There'd be a lot of issues over licensing some of that stuff.
I've got one final question. The Andy Partridge connection. Come on, tell me the. So we had a brief conversation on the phone, but I wanted to save some of it for here. So I first worked with Andy in '76. And I recorded some of their very first demos before they had a deal. And then, obviously, when I got the book, I saw the Andy connection and the Swindon connection. So tell me more about the lovely Andy.
I mean, the connection, it's not that great. I'm a huge XTC fan. I think, funny enough, a friend of mine, Jono, asked me tonight why I liked XTC so much. And I think it's because they are... Apart from the fact that Partridge is one of the greatest songwriters this country has ever produced. I mean, he's Ray Davis, he's Elvis Costello, he's John Lennon good. Yes. He is that great.
Yes.
XTC were the next Beatles, if you like. There's a lot of Beatlesque melodies going on there. And I was always a huge Beatles fan, so I grew up listening to the Beatles and listening to the Kinks and stuff like that. So they were an obvious progression for me. But over the years, although I would never ever call him a friend, Andy's become more than a nodding acquaintance, and he's been incredibly generous to me. I've interviewed him a few times. Met him once or twice. We spent a few nights together in a pub. He did a book reading of his own. He put a book out year before last. And I, along with a bunch of other fans, spent the entire night in a pub just with him sitting playing guitar for 2 hours, which is just stunning. He's just a really, really, really lovely guy who gets a lot of really bad press for being, difficult and hard to get on with. But actually, he's just, like a lot of people, he's a little awkward and a little shy and, has his own issues going on. But he's been very, very sweet to me and has been very supportive of this.
But it's interesting with artists that I would agree with that, but I think I know why he's like that. And it's just that because he doesn't suffer fools gladly, and also that most of the people around him when he was making his records were idiots, and he knew they were idiots.
There's a lot of that.
And he speaks his mind like I do, which is great. But also, he doesn't compromise on things, and that's why I think when you listen to those records now, those lyrics, sadly, are still as poignant as the day they were written. Yeah. And the sonic, masterly, the soundscape that he created, it wasn't of anything that was happening at the time. So consequently,
no, it's timeless. It's absolutely
stands
timeless.
up today as it did then. And I think that there are lots of genres of music where they're so time-stamped that whilst they are lovely and they take you back to certain things, if it can stand alone in its time, and I think John Grant is another. Back to John Grant is another example. You couldn't, if you listen to that record in 10 years' time, you won't know what year it is. And I think that's what's so great is because he's using great lyrics with this strange quasi-electronica, which I love because he comes at it in a totally different way. It's not he's not making electronic dance music. He's making his thing, but yet it's and melodically, what I love about him is that he highlights his lyrical melodies with some of his instruments, and so consequently, the songs they stand as they are, and you can't take one bit off of them, which I really, really love.
Absolutely, and I think John Grant's very Beatley.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of John Grant songs. There's a lot of Beatlisms in there. I mean, if you listen to the drum breaks on certain songs, it sounds like Ringo Starr playing.
But he does write lyrics that John Lennon or Paul McCartney would never have written, which I really.
Well, of course not, because neither Lennon or McCartney were HIV-positive gay men. But he does also write songs which have a very Lennon-esque kind of cut or edge to them. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like Grant. That's definitely one of the reasons why I love XTC and Andy Partridge. It takes you right back to the Beatles. It's just that incisive melodicness, but also there's also the truth that's in there. The truth, and it's music. It's about truth.
And what's your favourite David Bowie song?
Oh God, I love his cover of "Wild as the Wind." That's probably the one that always makes me cry. At the minute, it's probably Lazarus, because even though that still really cuts me every time I hear that, it makes me cry as well. Wild as Heroes. Yeah. Heroes. What a great record. Yeah. But they're all good.
They're all good.
The Laughing Gnome.
Yeah.
Or something really, really prosaic and weird, like Please Mr. Gravedigger. Something really, really mad from the early years. Gospel According to Tony Day, the B-side of was that the B-side of The Laughing Gnome?
So we need you on a pub quiz. Yeah. You're like my radio producer Neil. He knows, in fact, he knows more about. He knows so much. When we did our documentary, we managed to get a French version of one of the songs, which had never ever been, bizarrely enough, ever transferred from tape. Okay. And it was a few years ago, and we wrote a letter, and David gave us permission and sent the tapes. An actual tape turned up, which we then dubbed, because it was the French version of Heroes. But it was only used as a B-side. So Neil is like the other one you want on your pop quiz, because he'll know the catalogue number of the B-side.
Well, I used to work in record shops, so I could catalogue numbers of things like Meatloaf albums, all this kind of stuff from years and years ago.
Keep you for the pub quiz. That'd be fantastic. Anyway, well, thank you very much. We're over our allotted hours. Thank you so much for everyone for coming, and give Darryl a lovely round of applause. And I'm sure he'll happily be signing some books.
And thank you, Steve. Thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure. No, absolute
really
pleasure.
Appreciate it.
I enjoy it. In fact, I want you to sign my book as well.
Yes.
So.